Officially, I don't exist. My body is supposedly rotting in a cheap pine box 6 feet under, while my wife and son are currently sipping vintage champagne in a luxury penthouse bought with my life insurance money. They committed the perfect crime, erasing 35 years of my life with a few forged signatures and a bribe to a shady clinic. They thought an old engineer was too broken to climb out of the grave they dug for him. But they forgot one thing. I'm the one who built their world, and I'm the one who is going to dismantle it, piece by piece, until they have nothing left but the cold walls of a federal cell. It all started on a Tuesday, a day that was supposed to be my first taste of freedom after a month in what I thought was a high-end recovery center. I had a minor accident, a concussion that left me foggy, and my wife, Elena, insisted I needed professional rest. When I finally walked out of that smelling of bleach hellhole, the first thing I wanted was a simple cup of black coffee. I walked into a small cafe, smelling the roasted beans, feeling like I was finally returning to the land of the living. I handed my card to the young girl behind the counter. She swiped it once, then twice, a frown deepening on her face. She looked at the screen, then looked at me with eyes wide with genuine terror, as if she were staring at a ghost. "Sir," she whispered, her voice trembling, "I can't take this. The system says this card was canceled because the owner passed away 3 months ago." Before we get into the chilling details of how I discovered the rest of their betrayal, if you enjoy stories of justice and incredible life turnarounds, consider subscribing to the channel. It helps us share more stories like this with you, and you won't miss how this calculated revenge unfolds. I stood there, the heat of the cafe suddenly feeling like a furnace. I laughed, a dry, hollow sound telling her it must be a glitch. But as I walked toward my home, the reality began to sink in like lead. My key wouldn't fit the lock. The brass plate with my name was gone. I looked through the window of the house I spent 20 years paying for, and I didn't see my family. I saw a young couple sitting on my sofa, watching a movie. My furniture, my books, my life, everything had been cleared out. My wife and son hadn't just moved on, they had liquidated me. They didn't just report me dead, they sold the very ground I stood on. I was a ghost standing on a public sidewalk, watching strangers live in my memories, while the people I loved most were off spending the price of my soul. I wasn't just broke, I was legally erased. I stood on the sidewalk, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The young couple inside my house looked so happy, so settled. They had no idea that the man who had picked out those floorboards and painted those walls was standing in the shadows, officially a corpse. I wanted to scream, to bang on the glass, to demand they get out of my life. But I stopped myself. The cold, analytical part of my brain, the engineer, took over. If I caused a scene, the police would come. And what would I tell them? That I'm a dead man? Without an ID or a valid bank account? I was just a vagrant, harassing a nice family. I walked away, my legs feeling like lead. I ended up at a public library, using a guest computer with trembling hands. I searched for my own name. There it was, an obituary. A small, pathetic paragraph in a local digital paper claiming I had succumbed to complications from my accident. There even was a photo of a closed casket. My stomach churned. They didn't even give me a real service. They just hurried the paperwork through. Then I looked up property records. My house had been sold as is for a price far below market value. It was a fire sale. They wanted the cash, and they wanted it fast. The betrayal felt like a physical weight on my chest. I remembered Elena's face the day of the accident. She looked so concerned, so loving. She was the one who suggested the Cedar Rest Clinic. She told me the doctors there were the best for neurological recovery. Now I realized why it was so isolated. It wasn't a clinic. It was a dumping ground for the forgotten. While I was drugged on "5" that kept me in a permanent fog, she and my son, Mark, were signing my life away. They had forged my power of attorney while I couldn't even remember my own middle name. I sat in that library for hours, staring at the screen until the text blurred. I wasn't just a husband or a father to them. I was a retirement fund, a $500,000 payout. The memory of Cedar Rest Clinic still makes my skin crawl. It wasn't a place of healing. It was a gray, windowless warehouse for people the world wanted to forget. I remember the smell most of all, stale floor wax and cheap disinfectant covering up the scent of despair. For 4 weeks, I was kept in a state of chemical twilight. Every time I asked for my phone or a lawyer, a nurse with eyes as cold as marbles would tell me I was, and needed another dose of my, 7. I recall one specific evening when Elena and Mark came to visit. I was slumped in a plastic chair, my tongue feeling too thick for my mouth. Elena leaned in close, smelling of her expensive perfume, the one I bought her for our anniversary, and patted my hand. She whispered that she was taking care of everything, that I shouldn't worry about the bills or the house. I tried to tell her I felt strange, that I wanted to go home. But Mark just checked his watch and told me to trust the process. He didn't even look me in the eye. He was too busy scrolling through something on his phone, probably looking at luxury cars he couldn't afford. They had it all planned out. They chose a facility that was understaffed and poorly managed, a place where a sudden cardiac arrest in a middle-aged man wouldn't raise any eyebrows. They didn't even have to kill me physically. They just had to wait for the right moment to file the death certificate with a doctor who was either too lazy or too paid off to check the pulse. I realize now that the day I died was the day they moved me to the high security wing where no visitors were allowed. They simply told the clinic I had been transferred to a state hospital, told the state I was dead, and told the world nothing at all. I was a ghost long before I ever walked out those doors. I wasn't a person to them anymore. I was a liquidation event. I found myself sitting on a park bench, watching the sunset, shivering in a jacket that was starting to smell like the streets. I had no money, no home, and officially, no soul. But as the cold wind bit into my face, the fog in my brain finally cleared entirely. I realized the depth of the horror. They hadn't just stolen my money. They had stolen my dignity. I managed to track down a former colleague, an old coder named Bill, who owed me a huge favor from 10 years ago. When I showed up at his door, he nearly had a heart attack. He thought he was seeing a ghost. Once he calmed down and gave me a stiff drink, we started digging. What we found was even worse than I imagined. Elena and Mark hadn't just taken the house and my savings. They had filed a claim with my life insurance policy, a policy I had painstakingly paid into for decades to ensure they would be safe if I ever passed. The payout was $500,000, tax-free, instant wealth. Bill tracked the wire transfer. It didn't go into a local bank. It moved through a series of digital accounts before landing in a high-end brokerage firm registered in Florida. They didn't waste any time. While I was struggling to breathe in that cramped clinic room, they were already shopping for a new life. I saw digital receipts for first-class flights, designer clothes, and a lease for a penthouse in Miami that cost more per month than my first house. They were living like royalty on the price of my 11. I looked at the screen, watching the numbers dance, and felt a cold, hard knot form in my stomach. They thought they were clever. They thought they were modern criminals hiding behind screens and fake documents. But they forgot that I taught Mark how to use his first computer. I knew their passwords, their habits, and their weaknesses. They wanted a digital life? Fine. I was going to become their digital nightmare. I spent the next week living like a shadow in Bill's basement. Being legally dead has one strange advantage. Nobody is looking for you. To the world, I was a closed file. But to my family, I was about to become an invisible force. Using Bill's high-speed connection, I began to track their every move. They weren't just in Florida. They were living a life of absolute decadence. They had moved into a glass-walled penthouse overlooking the ocean in Miami. I watched their social media. Mark was posting photos of expensive watches and his new sports car, while Elena was at high-end spas, pretending to be a grieving widow who had finally found the strength to move on. It was nauseating. Every time I saw a picture of them smiling, I remembered the cold, damp floor of the clinic. But I needed to see it. I needed to know exactly where they were and what they were doing. I managed to bypass the security of their new smart home system. They were so arrogant that they hadn't even changed the recovery email for their main accounts. It was still my old secondary address. With a few clicks, I was inside. I could see through their security cameras. I could see the layout of their rooms, hear the clinking of their wine glasses, and listen to their conversations. One night, I watched them through a camera in their living room. Elena was complaining that the insurance payout was, quote, 14 to fully clear, and that they should have asked for more. Mark just laughed, leaning back on a white leather sofa that probably cost $5,000. He said, "Hearing those words from my own son, the boy I taught to ride a bike, broke something inside me." The last shred of hesitation vanished. I wasn't just going to get my money back. I was going to make sure that their new, shiny life became a prison of their own making. I was a ghost in their machines, and I was ready to haunt them. I started small. As an engineer, I know that the most effective way to collapse a structure isn't a big explosion. It's removing the right bolts at the right time. They had invested almost all the stolen insurance money into a, quote, 17 crypto trading platform Mark's friend had started. It was a classic move for a kid who wanted to feel like a genius without doing the work. They thought their wealth was safe in a digital vault. They didn't realize I still had the master keys to the encrypted drive where Mark kept all his recovery phrases. I began to mess with their comfort. First, it was the smart home. At 3 a.m., the lights would flicker on at full brightness. The thermostat would drop to 60 degrees, then spike to 90. I watched through the cameras as Elena stumbled through the hallway, clutching a silk robe, looking terrified. She called the security company, but they found nothing. To them, it was just a glitch. But I saw the look in her eyes. She was starting to feel like the air in that penthouse was heavy. She was starting to feel watched. Then, I went for the money. I didn't steal it, not yet. That would be too simple. Instead, I used my access to trigger, quote, 19 alerts on their brokerage accounts. I timed it perfectly. Every time Mark tried to make a big purchase or move funds into his crypto wallet, the transaction would freeze. I saw him screaming into his phone at customer service, his face turning a dark, ugly red. He was losing his mind because his, quote, 20 pile of cash was suddenly becoming unreachable. They were so focused on their luxury that they didn't see the walls closing in. They thought they had buried me, but I was the one controlling the lights, the temperature, and the very flow of their wealth. I was sitting in a dark basement, hundreds of miles away, but I had never been more present in their lives. They had traded a father and a husband for a paycheck, and now that paycheck was starting to burn their hands. The psychological game was the most satisfying part. I wanted them to feel the same confusion and helplessness I felt when I woke up in that clinic. I started sending echoes of my existence. I didn't send letters. That was too old-fashioned. Instead, I used their own luxury devices against them. One evening, as Elena was sitting on the balcony drinking wine, I remotely accessed the smart speaker right next to her. I didn't play a ghost voice or a scream. I played a recording of my own voice from an old family video, the one where I was teaching Mark how to build a model bridge. "Measure twice, cut once, son," my voice echoed softly in the salty air. I watched through the camera as Elena froze. The glass slipped from her hand, shattering on the white marble floor. She looked around, her face pale, trembling as she searched the empty balcony. A few minutes later, I changed the wallpaper on Mark's dual-monitor gaming setup. It wasn't a scary image, it was just a scan of my actual death certificate with a red question mark drawn over the date of death. When he walked into the room, he stopped dead. He didn't tell his mother. He just deleted it, his hands shaking so hard he could barely click the mouse. They were trapped in a gilded cage. They couldn't go to the police because, technically, nothing, quote, 23, quote, was happening to their electronics, and reporting a, quote, 24, quote, would make them look insane. More importantly, any investigation into their lives might reveal how they got their money in the first place. I saw them arguing more and more. Elena began drinking earlier in the day, and Mark was becoming obsessed with checking the locks. They were living in a constant state of, quote, 25, quote, but they had nowhere to run. They had killed me to get a better life, but now, the memory of me was making their lives a living hell. They were starting to realize that $500,000 can't buy peace of mind when your conscience is buried in a shallow, metaphorical grave. While my hauntings were breaking their spirits, I knew I needed more than just fear to finish this. I needed the law. But as a dead man, I couldn't just walk into a police station. I decided to contact the one entity that hates losing money even more than a ghost hates being forgotten: the insurance company. I spent 2 days drafting an anonymous, highly detailed tip to their fraud department. I didn't just tell them I was alive. I sent them the digital breadcrumbs of every forged signature, the GPS coordinates of the clinic, and the exact movement of the $500,000. I watched through the penthouse cameras as the pressure reached a boiling point. An investigator from the insurance company had called Elena, pretending it was a routine follow-up. She was a wreck. She sat on her expensive sofa, biting her nails until they bled, while Mark paced the floor like a caged animal. "We did everything right," he hissed at her. "The doctor signed it. The clinic is quiet. There is no way they know." He didn't realize that the, quote, 29 clinic was already being raided by state investigators, thanks to my tip. I made a secret deal with the insurance company's lead investigator through an encrypted chat. I told him I didn't want the money back yet. I wanted justice. They agreed to play along. They became my private army of suits and badges. They tracked the crypto wallets Mark thought were invisible and flagged them for federal seizure. I saw the moment the realization hit them. Mark tried to log into his account to move the remaining funds to an offshore bank, only to see a quote 30 banner across his screen. He screamed and threw his glass at the wall. They were broke, they were being watched, and they were terrified. The trap was set. All I had to do was wait for their big quote 31 quote party, the one they were hosting to celebrate their 1-year anniversary of quote 32 quote. They didn't know it was going to be the last night of their freedom. The night of the party arrived. The penthouse was filled with the sound of clinking glasses and fake laughter. Elena was wearing a dress that cost more than my first car, trying to play the elegant hostess, while Mark was bragging to a group of investors about his business intuition. They thought they had made it. They thought the glitches and the frozen accounts were just temporary hurdles. They were wrong. I was sitting in a van parked across the street, watching it all unfold through a tablet connected to their own security system. Next to me sat 2 federal agents, and the lead investigator from the insurance company. At exactly 10 p.m., Mark stood up to give a toast. "To a new life," he said, raising his glass, "where we finally have the resources to be who we truly are." That was my cue. I tapped a command on my keyboard. Suddenly, the music died. Every large screen in the penthouse, the one in the living room, the one in the bar, even the digital picture frames, switched at once. Instead of their vacation photos, a giant image of my death certificate appeared. But it was altered. In huge, blood-red letters across the center, it said, "Void. Subject still breathing." The room went silent. I watched Elena's face turn a ghostly shade of gray. Then, I activated the two-way audio. "You always were bad at math, Mark," my voice boomed through every speaker in the apartment. "You forgot to account for the fact that I built the systems you're trying to hide behind." The guests began to whisper, backing away as if the walls themselves were haunted. Then the front door didn't just open, it was breached. Police officers and federal agents flooded the room. Mark tried to run toward the balcony, but he was tackled to the floor before he could even reach the glass. Elena just collapsed into a chair, sobbing as the handcuffs clicked shut around her wrists. I stepped out of the van and walked into the building, heading up the elevator. When the doors opened, I stood face to face with the two people who had buried me alive. I wasn't a ghost anymore. I was their judge. I walked into the penthouse as the police were leading them out. Mark looked at me with pure terror, his mouth hanging open, unable to find words. Elena didn't even look up. She just kept shaking her head, whispering, "It's not possible," over and over again. I didn't feel the surge of anger I expected. Looking at them, cuffed and broken, I only felt a profound sense of relief. The quote 40 had fixed the final glitch in his life. The legal battle that followed was swift. With the insurance company and the FBI working together, the evidence of fraud and forgery was undeniable. Because it was a federal crime involving life insurance, they were sentenced to significant time in prison. Every penny they hadn't already spent was returned to the company, and I was officially resurrected in the eyes of the law. I sold the remains of my old life, including the memories that haunted me, and moved to a small, quiet house by the Pacific Ocean. Now I spend my days breathing the salt air and consulting on security systems, on my own terms. I am no longer a ghost. I am a man who was given a second chance, and this time, I'm living it for myself. Looking back at the empty chairs where my family used to sit, I sometimes wonder about the path I took. Did I do the right thing by playing such a long psychological game, or should I have gone to the authorities the moment I walked out of that clinic? What would you have done if you found out your own flesh and blood had traded your life for a paycheck? If you enjoyed this story of betrayal and calculated revenge, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss our next deep dive into the shadows of human nature. Drop a comment below and let me know your thoughts on my revenge. Was it too much or just enough? The end. Thank you for listening.